Preparing your affirmative action data for terminations. Good morning or afternoon, whichever applies to you. My name is Carla Irwin. I'm the president of Carla Irwin & Associates, and I also have with me Stephanie Thomas.
Hi, I'm Stephanie Thomas. I'm the founder of Thomas Econometrics. We are a full-service quantitative consulting firm, and we specialize in the economic and statistical analysis of employment decisions. And before we get started, Carla and I just want to remind you that the information we're going to be presenting today shouldn't be construed as legal advice. We're not giving you legal advice. We're just giving you information. If you need legal advice, you should contact your employment law professional.
Okay. The first thing that I want to talk about is just that this webinar series is really about getting back to basics. We're really breaking down the different types of data that you use in your affirmative action plan and wanting to for you to understand what you need, how you need to clean it up, and the data that you are going to use. The reason that we're doing this is that OSCCP is doing a lot of new regulations, new scheduling letter has come out, new enforcement when it comes to audits, and we just kind of wanted to remind everybody to kind of get back to basics, and getting to know and understand your data is the most important.
And today we're going to be talking about terminations. We previously discussed promotions and hiring, and if you missed those webinars or if you'd like to see them again, they're available for on-demand viewing at Carla's website and my website. And we're going to be talking today, like I said, about terminations. On the 26th, we'll be looking at workforce snapshot files. On November 9th, we'll be looking at applicant flow. And we're going to round out the first part of this series on November 30th with compensation. And we are planning essentially a part 2. So the part 1 that we're doing now is really getting back to the basics. The part 2, which we expect to start in December, will focus on the new scheduling letter, the new itemized listing, and how your hiring, promotions, terminations, workforce snapshot, applicant flow, and compensation data will be impacted in terms of production and what you need to do. So we're going to be announcing that schedule pretty soon, but we still have 3 more in the Back to Basics after today's presentation. So what we're going to talk about today with respect to termination are the data requirements that you need. We're going to talk about missing data and its effects on the AAP, and really about analyses in general. And we're going to conclude with some data scrubbing and validation techniques that we use when we're looking at termination data to make sure that the data is clean and comprehensive and correct.
First, let's run through the type of data that's required. And the first thing is to understand that you really need employee-level data, I mean the individual employee data. Don't summarize it, don't roll it up. You need to start with employee-level data. And so let's talk about the different types of fields you're going to put into your Excel spreadsheet, probably your Access database, however you're downloading it. And the first is to have employee name or number. My preference is number versus name because the larger your organization, the more likely you are to have people with the same name. And if you're trying to compare logs that we'll talk about later or year-over-year information, employee name doesn't work really well because it's not individual and unique to that person if you have more people with the same name. So number is always my preference. I will say that don't use Social Security number. Some people, some companies, some HRIS systems don't have employee number, and they use Social Security number. I never advise to do that just because that's very confidential information. If you're working with a consultant, I don't want that information. Having that outside of your system probably isn't a good idea. So if you don't have employee number, don't use Social Security number. Then just go ahead and use employee name. Next, race, gender, and ethnicity. I'm sure that that's pretty obvious. We need to know what everybody's race, gender, and ethnicity is. Job title. And job title at time of termination. And this can be a little bit tricky depending on your system because some systems, once you terminate somebody, it kind of takes their title off. and they just kind of are classified as termination. So when you're creating your report, you really want to think about if that's the way your system works, that you may have to grab the job title from the day before they were terminated instead of the day of termination in case your system does that. I've seen that multiple times. Location. This is really important for those companies who have multiple locations and you're downloading the information all at one time because you're going to need it to be able to separate out your AAPs. Rehire, hire, termination, promotion dates. Essentially on all the employee activity logs, I suggest having all of this information on there just because it's a way to cross-check amongst logs, and we'll talk a little bit about that later. Type of termination. This is really voluntary versus involuntary. That's very important to know. I'm going to a little sneak peek into the new scheduling letter. That's something that the OFCCP is going to be requesting now when you submit for the desk audit is type of termination. And then finally, what is your term reason? And we're going to talk about this in more detail later in terms of policy and the use of it. But term reason, you really need to know why someone left the organization. Was it due to misconduct? Was it a resignation? Was it a reduction in force? What are the different reasons why they left the organization? It's important. It may help you determine whether it is voluntary or involuntary. It's also going to help you to find out if you're coding things consistently, coding things correctly. I've gone through a lot of information for clients where the person looks back, 9 months later, and they're like, oh, that really wasn't due to misconduct. It was a policy violation or whatever the case may be, because we use that information in the event that there's adverse impact or questions from the OFCCP or in litigation as business justification. And then we'll be looking for specific types of documents depending on what the type of termination is.
And just to sort of follow on that, with respect to the type of termination and the termination reason, that information is really important if you're doing an adverse impact analysis or if you're involved in litigation or compliance investigation. So we really can't stress enough that the type of termination and the termination reason codes really need to be filled in. You need to have distinct codes. You need to be able to distinguish between a voluntary termination, an involuntary termination, a reduction in force, a position elimination. So it's really important to have unique codes, and as we're going to talk about later, we want you to use those codes consistently across different termination events. And as we always say, there's some non-required data, but data that we suggest that you keep in this process. It's always easier to get the information in one shot than to have to go back and re-pull data and try to match it with the information that you've already extracted. So it's best to get your expanded demographic information, capture that information on other protected characteristics as you're going through this process. Other things to consider are age, disability status, veteran status, marital status, sexual orientation, any other kind of demographic information that you have about your employees. And again, the collection and maintenance of this information really is going to depend on the particular laws of your locality, your state, and so forth. But if you collect it on an ongoing basis, it's going to be a lot easier in the long run, and it's easier to have it and not need it for an audit or litigation than to need it and not have it.
And we have disability and veteran status highlighted because this is kind of non-AAP data, but you do have disability and veteran AAPs, the narrative, soon to come probably a much more robust affirmative action plans for both, and then also a good time to remind you about your FES 100 report that now you can't start entering until November 1st. There was another delay.
Okay, so let's talk about required documentation. And as we've mentioned before, electronically maintained information is best. It's always better to have electronically maintained information than paper documentation and boxes of records. So with respect to termination, you're going to want to maintain any information that's used in any of your termination decisions. And when we say termination decisions, we're talking about Involuntary terminations, we're talking about reductions in force or position eliminations. You also want to keep documentation around voluntary terminations as well. So if somebody comes to you and says, I'm resigning my position because I have a better opportunity, or I'm leaving the workforce, I'm retiring, any kind of documentation around those voluntary departures, you're still going to want to maintain. So it's not just the involuntary and the reduction in force, it's really any kind of termination event. And the kinds of documentation that you want to keep, the first is attendance and leave policies, anything that relates to the attendance and leave policies and disciplinary consequences of violating those policies. Some companies have a policy where you're allowed so many absences or unexcused absences over a certain amount of time. You want to make sure that you have all that information documented and accessible. You also want to have your disciplinary procedures well documented, again, just like the attendance and leave policies. Any kind of disciplinary process, whether it's a one and done, zero tolerance, or whether it's a verbal warning, written warning, etc. Make sure that you have those documented. You also want to keep tight documentation on your performance evaluations. Ideally, you'd like to have signed copies of those performance evaluations maintained electronically. You also need to keep the criteria that were used in those performance evaluations. Depending on the particular company and the particular position, the criteria that you evaluate your employees with can vary. So it's important to maintain the criteria that you used, and it's also important that those criteria are validated. If your criteria are not validated, then you run the risk of a discrimination claim based on the application of those criteria. So it's important to have your criteria validated before you use them, and it's important to maintain documentation about how those criteria were validated and that they were in fact validated. And you also want to keep documentation of the series of events leading up to the termination event. So for instance, if you have a disciplinary policy that's a verbal warning, then a written warning, then a suspension, you want to make sure that all of those things are documented for each employee. Because if you have to defend the termination decision, you're going to need that documentation to go back and show that your policies and procedures were followed and that there actually was a legitimate business reason for the termination. Basically, any other information that you consider in the termination process should be maintained. So, for instance, if we're talking about a reduction in force, it's important to document and maintain the business justifications for the reduction. We're going to talk about that a little later. But anything that goes into the termination process and the termination decision-making really needs to be maintained. And just to tie in with something Carla mentioned earlier about the historical information, it's important to have a chronology and to maintain the history when we're talking about termination decisions, because usually there is a series of events that lead up to that event, that lead up to the termination. So it's really important to maintain that historical information and have that chronology so that you can defend that decision in the event of an audit or litigation.
And another point is that, electronically maintained information is best, and it's easiest to get a hold of, especially quickly. But there's a very good chance that a lot of this documentation you don't have electronically, or kind of it's scattered throughout. So the annual AAP process is a really good time to evaluate the state of your documentation, even if there is an adverse impact. Say a certain percentage, say 1%, 2%, 5%, whatever the case may be, that you review the documentation and make sure that you have what you need when it comes to termination. Okay, next we're going to talk about what are some common missing data points that we find when we get data from our clients. And the first thing is termination date. Now, it's typically there, but a few problems that I have with unique situations is when someone didn't return from leave, there's a sabbatical. So those unique situations, and when do you, what term date do you use? So really knowing and understanding what your system automatically does is important. So if it is a didn't return from leave, is the term date that's pulling on your term report kind of that next day after they didn't return from leave, or is it when they started leave, or that kind of thing? So it's really important to understand what your term date is for those unique situations. Type of termination, voluntary or involuntary. So I'm going to take some time to talk about this. Voluntary and involuntary is very important when it comes to termination. There's less, there are fewer issues and harder business justifications when it comes to involuntary. Involuntary, the business made the decision and you have to justify it. Voluntary, your employee made that decision. Now there may be reasons behind it that can be an issue, but that's a much easier sell to the OFCCP in the event of an audit and that there's adverse impact if those group of employees are voluntary versus involuntary. So really important to know the difference and to know which codes that you have are voluntary or involuntary. It has been important. It's going to be very important with the new scheduling letter like we talked about. Reason for termination. Like I said before, really understanding misconduct, resignation, reduction in force, position elimination. This is extremely important in the event of an audit or litigation for us to be able to help you, or for you to really understand when you're evaluating data, what is the reason people are leaving, and in the event that you have to justify yourself in a lawsuit or with the OFCCP, you really need to know this information to get the business justification. And also, there'll be different types of documentation that we would suggest that you have. So if it is a resignation, was there a resignation letter, or was it just verbal? And can we get any documentation about that? If it was misconduct, what is your conduct policy? What was violated? How was it handled? If it was a reduction in force, was there analysis behind it with regard to the reduction in force? The pools of candidates are going to be very important with reduction in force. Position elimination, again, if you compare that to reduction in force, position elimination, it's that position and everybody in that position is going, where reduction in force, it can be, a group of people in different positions. There's different ways to handle it and different justifications and documentation that you would need and that we would ask for in the event that you needed to justify yourself. Internal termination documentation, again, it's kind of a continuation of making sure that you have that documentation internally that you need to keep for termination reasons. And again, I'm saying it with regard to it's justification for an audit if there's adverse impact or if there's litigation. But remember, as a federal contractor, affirmative action regulations, state that you need to keep employment records, and termination records are employment records. So you do have that obligation there. Comparators. So this is really important. It's something that you have that federal contractors and all of us have kind of thought about in the past, and we may use it in the event that there's an issue, but not a lot of thought has gone into comparators. But with the new scheduling letter, this is going to be a requirement that you show what your comparators are with regard to termination. So when you do a reduction in force, what groups of people did you look at? How did you make that decision? When it comes to position elimination, how did you decide that position was going to be eliminated? When, in terms of obviously resignation, there won't be comparators. It'll be a one-to-one if it's a misconduct or if it's a, some sort of policy violation. Then if there are no comparators. But when you have those instances where you do think about groups of people and make decisions, that comparators are very important.
Just to jump in with one thing to sort of follow up on that, with the policy violations or the discipline, I have seen cases where a group of protected individuals, either women or racial minorities, have claimed that their discipline was more severe than males or whites for the same infraction. So depending on the type of involuntary termination and what the setting is, you may actually have comparators. Those kinds of discipline issues really aren't going to come into play in terms of the AAP, but they can present themselves in litigation. So it's just something to keep in mind.
That's a good point, and also a good point to say that's more important. And another important point to say why you need to have your internal documentation, that you have your policies that we'll talk about that, they'll have them set. You have your documentation of how you treat everybody consistently so that you can, give your business reasons in the event of litigation in that type of case. Information regarding previous waves of reduction in force. So, a lot of companies have had to do multiple waves of layoffs, and it's really important to keep the documentation of your decision-making process with each wave. What happens in an AAP is you're going to take a year's worth of data and you're going to look at it. And in that year, you can have 2 or 3. So if you had to do layoffs every quarter, you've got 4 waves of layoffs, each with their own justification. The reason your first layoff happened is very different from the reason your second layoff happened, and how you may have made those decisions could be completely different. When they get rolled up and the OFCCP looks at them, there could be adverse impact, but when you break them down into the different waves that give the justification, it becomes clear. So again, information regarding different waves is very important.
Okay, so let's talk about some common data pitfalls. And the first pitfall that we see is the distinction between voluntary versus involuntary. It seems pretty obvious. Voluntary is if the employee makes the decision. Involuntary is if the employer makes the decision. And there's various kinds of involuntary terminations. Policy violation, discipline issues, reductions in force, position eliminations. Commonly what I see in the HR data of my clients is that there really is only a vol versus the INV. And that's really not enough information. We need additional explanations. We need information about if it's a voluntary termination, for instance, did that person leave for a better opportunity? Are they leaving the workforce? Are they retiring? Did they take an early retirement? Was there an incentive package for early retirement? Was that incentive package connected with a reduction in force? So it's not always 100% clear voluntary versus involuntary. Having just those, that one code is not enough. We need the underlying reason for the termination event. And you absolutely must record whether the termination is part of or not part of a reduction in force. And as Carla mentioned before, and as I'm going to talk about a little later, this becomes particularly important if you have multiple waves of reductions in force over a relatively short period of time. It's important to know and to be able to go back historically and pull out who was involved in the reduction in force, who wasn't. And sort of tying in with that reduction in force is comparators. And unfortunately, a lot of organizations don't keep information on comparators when they're doing a reduction in force. The thing with comparators, and we sort of touched on this last time with promotions, if you do not define who those comparators are, someone else will define them for you. So if you are looking at a particular department and you need to reduce the department headcount by 10, it's really important to document who was compared to whom for purposes of selecting the terminated employees, what criteria were used, how each of the potential terminees were ranked on each of those criteria, how that decision was made. So comparators are really, really important, and unfortunately a lot of organizations don't document the comparator and the comparator process. So just to say it again, if you don't document your comparators, if you don't identify them, somebody else is going to, and you may not like the way that they define them. The final pitfall that I want to talk about here is the difference or the consistent use of voluntary or involuntary. I mean, it seems pretty obvious that if the employee makes the decision, it's voluntary. If the employer makes the decision, it's involuntary. But it's really, really important to make a consistent application of those codes. And again, if you have the reason for termination documented, that'll help you identify whether or not you're using those codes consistently. For instance, if you had a person who was coded as a voluntary termination, but the reason for termination was violation of company policy, then that should set off a red flag, and you have to say, is my code wrong or is my termination reason wrong? So it's really important to consistently use your voluntary versus involuntary codes. Most of the times it's really easy. Again, employee makes the decision, it's voluntary. Employer makes the decision, it's involuntary. But what do you do in a situation where you're offering an early retirement incentive as part of a reduction in force? So you're making the decision to reduce your workforce. The employee is making the decision to take advantage of that incentive package and retire early. Is that voluntary or is it involuntary? Theoretically, you could make an argument either way, but whichever way you choose, you need to make sure that you're consistently using that code. If you're going to code it as voluntary, then everybody who takes the incentive package as part of that reduction needs to be coded the same way. It's really important to use these things consistently because it's nearly impossible to go back and recreate these things after the fact. If you have to go back 6 months or a year to try to recreate, the reason for termination, whether or not somebody was part of a reduction in force, who those comparators were, it's going to be nearly impossible to do. So it's important to, keep these pitfalls in mind, make sure that you're using everything consistently, and that you document things on an ongoing basis.
And another, I think those are really great examples. Another one is when an employee walks off the job, is that voluntary or involuntary? They voluntarily walked off the job. Do they know the consequences? Does your policy say that if someone walks off the job that they're automatically terminated? That way it's the company's decision. So again, a really important consistent use of voluntary versus involuntary. Okay, next we're going to talk about policies and procedures around terminations. And, we've talked about this with the other topics, and it's just as important with terminations. And, I think terminations is one of those things that does get overlooked. And setting a termination policy and procedure is very important. And I guess by termination policies and procedures, you have to think about it just not on the day you terminate them, but the disciplinary procedures that they have leading up to that. So do you have a very strict workforce, which is typically what I see in manufacturing or distribution, that kind of thing, where it's, like Stephanie mentioned before, after so many absences, then you get a point, and then so many points, and then you're terminated. So really creating a policy and sticking by it, or are your policies going to be a little bit more broad and allow for more subjectivity on the part of the managers, all of those things. But the one key thing is to set the termination disciplinary policies and procedure, follow it consistently, require that employees follow the process, that managers know and understand the process and follow it, and that every manager knows how to handle this, and every employee should know, and it should be explained to them the consequences of their action. And every HR person should be able to walk either an employee or a manager through the process. And termination, and when you're talking about disciplinary, a lot of times managers are involved in this process, sometimes even before HR knows about it. So it's very important to get them trained and that they understand what the process is so that it can be implemented consistently. Again, defining voluntary versus involuntary, I think we've talked a lot about this, but it's very important. So set your set what your termination reasons are going to be, and to determine whether they're voluntary or involuntary, and use them consistently throughout your process. Business justification for reduction in force. It's really not good enough to say that we just needed to save money in our payroll expenses. Really document the full justification. I think Stephanie did a great job of saying, okay, was it the department, and within the department, how did you decide how to cut those 10 heads? Because not everybody is looked at evenly, because you have different levels within a department. How was that decision made? Because that's really going to be your business justification if you're asked about it in litigation or an OFCCP audit. Here's another little thing that I have come across a few times is resignation, package, ask to leave, and how all that works, involuntary versus voluntary, but more specifically, how are you implementing this in a consistent fashion? There's nothing wrong with asking someone to leave and offering them a package. What can be an issue, and I have seen this in the past, is are you consistently applying this? So a lot of times when this happens is when there's not a lot of great documentation as to an issue that an employee may have, and so a package is given to them and set them to leave. But when you combine all of those terminations, you see that there may be one race over another or one gender over another that was offered a package or was asked to leave, versus going through the full termination process and not given a package. So that's really, it's an issue that I've seen and something to really be aware of. Because a lot of times terminations, you look at them just in the moment. And remember, OFCCP rolls them up for a year. And also in litigation, they're going to try and grab as many terminations and compare them as possible. So this is an issue to really be aware of.
And also, just to sort of tie back into that, when you look at these things individually, like you're offering a package to one person, you may see a different result when you roll those things up. The same is true if you have multiple waves of reductions in force. You can get a completely different picture looking at one reduction in force versus 4 waves of a reduction in force rolled together. So it's important that you really document everything so that you have the flexibility to look at these one at a time, individually, collectively, over a specific period of time, and so forth. Okay, so what are the effects of missing termination data? Again, if you have incomplete or bad data, you're going to have an incomplete or a bad affirmative action plan. Your statistics are only as good as your underlying data. And if you have data problems, if you don't have your comparators identified, if you didn't use your codes consistently with respect to involuntary versus voluntary termination, any problems in your data are going to create the possibility for inaccurate conclusions. So you may have a situation where if you had a reduction in force, for instance, because of data problems, because of missing or inaccurate data, it might look as though you have a problem with respect to age, and age is one of the hot areas with respect to terminations and reductions in force. So bad data might make you think that you have a problem with respect to age, but when you clean up the data and fill in all the holes, you really don't have a problem. The opposite is also true. It could appear as though you don't have any issues with respect to gender, race, age, etc., but because of that missing or bad data, you really do have an issue, and your analysis, because of that bad data, is masking the fact. So this really cuts both ways. It can hide things that are going on, and it can make you think that you have issues that you really don't. So missing data, bad data, makes it really, really difficult to identify where the real issues are.
And from an affirmative action program perspective, so if you use this bad data that you have, and analyze it and say, okay, here's where my barriers are, or I've created all these programs for recruitment for women, minorities, vets, individuals with disabilities, whatever the case may be, and they're leaving, and they're leaving out the back door. And so you try and create programs or fixes. If you have bad data, all of that is, the programs that you put on top of that are, as useless as your conclusion. So to keep that in mind also.
And it seems like we're always coming back to the time and expense and resource costs when it comes to missing data. This is the big one that everybody complains about. How much time and effort and money we're going to spend internally collecting this information and cleaning it up and getting it right. And the consultants' hourly invoices are skyrocketing because we have to keep giving them new data and refresh the data sets. It's really important to get this stuff right the first time. I've seen cases where the expense, the financial expense, has actually doubled because of missing data. And any time that you have your internal personnel tied up on data cleanup, that means they're not focusing on the day-to-day responsibilities that they were hired to focus on. So, you know, there's productivity loss, there's all kinds of implications here with respect to time and expense and resources. So get it right the first time. It'll save you a lot of time and effort in the long run.
And a reminder, from an OFCCP audit perspective, you have 30 days to respond. And so those 30 days can go very quickly if you don't have good data.
So when it comes to litigation with respect to termination, this is a hot area. Given the current economic situation and what's happened in the recent past, a lot of companies have had to reduce the sizes of their workforce. You know, the voluntary packages, the incentives to get people to retire early. Termination litigation is a hot area right now, particularly with respect to age discrimination. And it's really, really important that you have complete comprehensive data. If you're missing your data points, if you don't have information about comparators for a particular reduction in force, it can really be a make or break point. If you don't have that information, if you don't define the comparators, if you can't articulate and support empirically the decisions that you made, then you're going to be in a far worse position in the event of litigation.
And from an audit perspective, you know, if you have inaccurate data that produces, you know, false positives or false negatives, if it's a false positive, the OFCCP says, okay, you know, you have an issue. Your business, you know, your business justification doesn't look great because your term codes or the missing data, you don't have that documentation to back it up. It's going to end in a conciliation agreement. If you have false positives and the OFCCP decides to look into that, also they're going to start digging. We'll ask questions. Why? They may decide to come on site and ask managers, why did this person leave? They may talk to employees. Again, it can end in a conciliation agreement. Because when you have the inaccurate data, don't have a good business justification, and the OFCCP is going to dig and very easily can end a conciliation agreement for reporting, you know, for monetary settlements, that sort of thing, and really that's not how you want that to end up. So next we're going to talk about data scrubbing and validation. You know, so once we get this data, now you know what type of data that we're looking for. You know what are some of the missing data points. Now we're going to go through with you what are some of the things we do to find issues and help clean up the data. The first point I want to make is you know, understanding what your termination policies are. So, you know, start with understanding and make available disciplinary action steps. So when you're starting the process, it's good to know if you're working with a consultant, it's good to give them that information. Know how and when to use termination codes. So again, there may be some sort of key that you work with, either internally or that you were to give your consultant with regard to these types of termination reasons are voluntary, these types of are involuntary. We've talked about that. Consistency is the key. If you don't have set codes, if you don't have set termination and disciplinary policies, then it's almost impossible to be consistent and you're going to get yourself in trouble. So let's start with, do you have the right people? So when you download out of your HRIS system your list of terminations, there's a couple checks that I do when it comes to making sure you have everybody that was terminated on the list. First is I take a look at last year's workforce snapshot, so that kind of point-in-time report that said, here's everybody at the company on this date, and then you look at your current one, and anybody who was on last year's and not on this year's, are they on the termination log? And I typically find with each client that I do, most of my clients have multiple plans, I will find one or two people per client that it's just missed. It could be for multiple reasons. One, it could be there were, if it's a high turnover type of environment, high turnover that also then includes rehires for different times of the year. it's just an issue with the HRIS system in terms of it gets a little confused sometimes if you have multiple hires and multiple terminations within the plan year. That can be an issue. Or it could just be an issue of, especially terminations that are late in the year, what happens is it doesn't get entered until after maybe you've pulled that data, but then your workforce snapshot doesn't have them on it. So that can be an issue and where I find some missing terminations. I also, like I mentioned in the beginning, I'll check the hire log for those people who have a term date. That's why I have it on there. Again, high turnover that have recalls. It's really important to make sure that you get each step of the process, each time that we were hired and each time they were termed. That's particularly important. And then kind of after we know that we have the right people, then we start looking for the right codes. And for the right codes, I'm talking about your EEO and AA job group codes. So by job title, do you have the same EEO and AA job group codes across all of your employment activities, meaning across your hires, promos, and applicant flow, and then also your workforce snapshot. So really use your workforce snapshot as your base document, and make sure that by job title you have all of the same EEO and AA job group codes, and then once that is set, then make sure that each of your employment activity logs have those same by job title EEO and AA job group codes. And then that really sets you up for being able to do, and we'll talk about this in the next series, how do you start evaluating that for the scheduling letter. That really makes sure that you have good data, that you have the right codes, job titles, things like that, so that when you start to do your evaluation, you're really doing meaningful evaluation.
The biggest data scrubbing and validation question that I ask is, are we consistent? And when we say consistent, we mean a couple of different things. In the previous webinars, we kind of talked about this a little bit. Automation really makes things a lot easier. If you have electronically maintained information that's computer readable, when you're trying to go through and do an adverse impact analysis or look for consistency, we really want to automate that process as much as possible. And if there's variation in entries, computers are stupid, so they're going to treat those variations as different entries. So if you have a termination reason code, better opportunity that's spelled out, and you have a different one that says better opportunity elsewhere, the computer is going to treat those two as different entries. So whatever code you're using, whatever descriptor you're using, you want to make sure that it's applied consistently, because we do see problems, and we have to spend a lot of time cleaning and scrubbing the data if there's variations in those text entries. But really, I think the key point with respect to consistency is whatever your particular organization's way of doing things and coding things, are you consistently applying that technique to each termination event? So it doesn't really matter to me from an analysis perspective whether you code somebody who takes an incentive package as part of the reduction in force, if you code that as voluntary or involuntary. What really matters is whether you're coding everybody who took that incentive package the same way. If you're going to code one person as voluntary, you have to code everybody as voluntary. You can't have a mix of voluntary or involuntary. You can't have a mix of business justification within the same reduction in force. Whatever your policy, whatever your way of coding the data is going to be, you need to make sure that that's consistently applied for everybody, for every wave of reduction in force, for every position elimination, for every disciplinary termination. So you want to make sure that you're consistent when you apply those criteria. The final point I want to make with respect to consistency deals particularly with reductions in force. And here are the terminations that you're making and the selections that you've made as part of the reduction in force, are those consistent with your stated justification? So, for instance, if you have a multi-divisional business and you're involved in multiple lines of business and you decide that you're going to sell off one of those lines of business, the selling of that line of business becomes the justification for the reduction in force. So what we want to see is whether or not the people who were selected for termination as part of that reduction in force come from that business line. If you say that it's an abandonment or a sale of a line of business, but the people that are selected for termination have nothing to do with that line of business, that's a problem. So when it comes to reductions in force, you want to make sure that your data and the people that you've actually selected for termination are consistent with your stated reasons and justifications for the reduction in force. And finally, the last thing that I look for in terms of data scrubbing and validation is where are the data gaps? Looking at the gaps can help you identify any shortcomings or problems in your processes and procedures. Are the data gaps sort of a one-off thing where we're missing something for one person, we might be missing something else for another person, but in general, our data is pretty comprehensive, or is it a systemic gap? Are we missing the same kind of information for everybody on the termination log? Are there gaps in our policies and procedures that we need to fill in? So figuring out where your data gaps are, knowing whether they're that unique kind of one-off situation or whether there's a more systemic problem, it gives you an opportunity to correct that problem if it is systemic. And by correcting it now, you're going to save yourself time and aggravation when you go back and do this next year and the year after. So identifying whether it's a random gap or a systemic gap really can help you improve your overall process, and it can really help you identify where, in the grand scheme of things are getting askew.
And I have a question that I want to address before we kind of move on to the next slide. And so the question is how to handle an employee moving from one business unit to another. Do you recommend terminating from one subsidiary and hiring to another? First I'll kind of say there's a couple different languages. Is subsidiary, are they two different companies? Do you have them all in the action plans? If it's really just another business unit, what I recommend is you don't terminate them. You just, if they're getting a promotion and that's why they're moving, then it should be, coded as a promotion. Or it may just be a transfer. And so if it's, if they're keeping the same job, it's not a promotion, then it's just coded as a transfer. Now, the use of subsidiary kind of makes me think about, is it a completely different company? The answer would be a little bit different. Any other advice you would give, Stephanie, on that question?
Again, I think it really comes down to the overall structure of the organization and the relationship between where the person was working and where they're going to be working now. If it's all rolled under the same, and if the same policies and procedures apply to all divisions, and if the subsidiary really is a different line of business or a division, then I think the easiest way to do it, the best way to do it, is to code it as a transfer. If it's a completely different organization with completely different policies and procedures, different decision makers, if it's a separate legal entity, then probably termination and hire or termination rehire is the way to go. But it really depends on the underlying structure of the organization.
Yeah.
Okay, so when it comes to data scrubbing and validation, as we've mentioned before, it's really an interactive process, and no data set, no matter how hard you try, is going to be 100% perfect 100% of the time. So it's really an interactive process between you and your consultants, whether you're working on an affirmative action plan, or whether you're involved in an OFCCP investigation, or if you're involved in litigation. It's really an interactive process, and I think Carla would agree, part of our jobs as consultants is to identify any anomalies in the data, anything unusual that we see, and to identify any potential problems with the data and go back to you to ask clarifying questions. And then, once you receive these questions, once we say, this person looks a little different than the others, what's going on here, we're missing this data point, it's really up to you to investigate those anomalies and the potential data issues. And it's up to you because you're more familiar with your internal policies and procedures and the data collection than we are. So you're going to have more insight into that process than we will. So it's really an interactive process. We ask the clarifying questions. you come back with the answers, and we work together to really get the most accurate and comprehensive data set we can before we even think about, finalizing an AAP, finalizing a termination roster, doing any kind of an adverse impact analysis.
So I would say be ready for the questions. One thing that I think clients get surprised about is, okay, so they send data, it's pulled out of their HRIS system or their applicant tracking system, whatever the case may be, and then we find these holes kind of through the validation process that we've been talking about. We come back and ask questions, and clients can get surprised, especially first-time clients. I know that have worked with me, they kind of think, well, here's the data, here's what I've got. The other thing that they get surprised about is, so we can find where some of the holes are, is that there are also ways, if you have holes, how do you fill in the gaps? And so we can help talk you through how you might fill the gaps if you don't have it. So again, if you're not sure about voluntary or involuntary, but you have some termination codes, we can work with you. But be ready for questions and be ready for that interaction. And we have ways to help you, figure out where you might find the information if it's not readily apparent straight out of your system.
Okay, so to kind of wrap things up here, again, bad data equals bad AAP. If you have bad data, you're going to have a bad plan. You're not going to be able to get accurate conclusions about what's really going on inside of your organization. And the thing with terminations really can give you a lot of insight into employee retention and turnover issues. And employee retention and turnover is really hot right now. There's a study that I read recently that indicated the cost of recruiting and hiring and onboarding a new employee is about 150% of the department or the departing employee's salary. So the cost of hiring and onboarding a new employee is 150% of the departing employee's salary. That's pretty expensive. So anything that you can do to keep your employees happy and productive, to retain them and to reduce turnover really can have a financial impact on your bottom line. So doing a termination analysis as part of your AAP can really help you identify the underlying causes of your problems in retention and turnover. It can help you, by looking at those codes, can help you figure out why employees are leaving, what areas are most affected by turnover, what departments or divisions are having retention issues. And it really can help you address those issues and figure out how to keep your employees happy, engaged, and reduce your turnover, which will save you in the long run.
And, as federal contractors, we're all working towards building a diverse workforce, becoming an employer of choice. And the OFCCP is really looking over our shoulder and very heavily scrutinizing us in the OFCCP audit process. So we put all this time and energy to put the programs together, to do the diversity outreach, to contact organizations, schools, universities, whatever it may be. So we put all that time and effort into that. And then if we have them leaving, out of the back door, that's an issue. And again, that means that there's some sort of a barrier within your workforce that's causing them to leave. So you may do a great job of recruitment, but for some reason, after a certain amount of time, that they're leaving. And analyzing that and knowing that you have good, clean data to analyze that can mean the total employee experience can be good. So you can do a great job of hiring this diverse workforce, becoming an employer of choice, and then making sure that you have an experience when they're employed, that makes them want to stay and work their way through your organization. And unless you have good termination data, you're just really not able to do that, and all that time and energy is wasted. So at this point, we are at the end of our presentation. Last slide is our contact information. If for any reason you have a question, feel free to either email or call either one of us. Our websites are both on there. They both have information on, there's the archived webinars from the previous ones, there are newsletters, there are blogs, there are ebooks. There's a lot of information on both websites for you on many different topics from EEO and affirmative action. So feel free to go there and get as much information as you want or need. I was just kind of giving some time to see if any questions came through the chat board, and I don't see any right now. But otherwise, I want to thank you for participating. Hope you continue to be part of the webinar series, and also hope that you sign up for the new webinar series where we're going to focus on some of these items with regard to the new scheduling letter.
Thanks, everybody.